Hi guys, Nuance with Nikki, and I'm trying to pick up on my Black Excellence Tuesdays. I did make a promise last year. I also seem to be waking up from under the rock I've been living under since my mom passed away, and I've been inspired by Kinsani over here to start this up again. I'm absolutely in awe of this young woman. Really, genuinely. I've said on this channel before, South African children can debate race in circles around people from many parts of the world. And so, you know what? I can't sing her praises highly enough. Why don't you guys just listen to Kinsani? Like, her delivery speaks for itself.
I'm sorry to say this, but I think we've been too hard on the Afrikaner refugees. My eyes and bleeding liberal heart have now been opened to the absolute tragedy, the suffering, the pain that these poor bastards have had to endure, mainly thanks to this book, which is The Virgins by Gillian Becker. I bought this back in high school because it was on the list of banned apartheid fiction, and I couldn't figure out what was seemingly a pretty harmless young adult novel could do to deserve such censorship. It's set in 1970 South Africa, and it's just a coming-of-age story about a wealthy white teenage girl in Johannesburg. And in between the very beautifully written accounts of the dizzying anxiety and fear and thrill of adolescence, with its misguided crushes, changing hormones, and that desperate rush to the big real-world adulthood promises, which, in retrospect, that's right. There are also some of the most revealing and fascinating insights into the white psyche during apartheid South Africa. Annie Furman, our protagonist, is from a very well-off family. She's attending Rodin, which even back then was a very expensive private school, living on one of those giant Houghton estates with a swimming pool, tennis court, and at any point at time, at least 4 full-time domestic staff, which I'm pretty sure includes like a butler, there's a laundry maid, a general housekeeper, and all of this on the single income of her doctor father. And what we have here is a typical day in the life of a white housewife in apartheid. While Annie's mother is an English-speaking woman, I can't imagine her experience is vastly different from that of a rich Afrikaans woman of the time. Mrs. Furman did not come downstairs until 11.
Hang on, so let's just give a bit more for those of us who might not know, people who may not be from South Africa. Let's just have a look at Houghton. So Houghton is a very old part of Johannesburg. It was, is it Houghton like that? I think it's like that. Okay, anyway, it was designed as a wealthy suburb in Johannesburg, sort of away from the mines, and it's absolutely gorgeous. If perhaps past its former glory today, but still absolutely gorgeous. And so Rodin as well. What is this? A Houghton Spa. Okay, house. Just a normal Houghton house. Right, today. Okay. I wonder what you guys think when I, a modern South African, say it's actually past its former glory. But honestly, guys, if you know, you know. Right. But Rodin as well. It was a school I almost went to until... Okay, let me not snitch. But an absolutely amazing school, very famous. So when I think about Rodin, I think about the roses of Rodin. Like, they cultivate their own roses. So it's this very posh South African Joburg school. Okay, so when she's mentioning Houghton and Rodin, my Joburg ears prick. Do you know what I mean? That's the kind of thing. So it's kind of the way someone might feel when mentioning Camps Bay in Cape Town, or I don't know, perhaps how a New Yorker might feel when someone mentions a school in the Hamptons or something. All right, so bear that in mind.
She was very busy between her 7 o'clock tea and her descent. In addition to breakfast, they also came to her room, generally on different days, the masseuse twice a week, the beautician twice, Mrs. Ringer to fit the simpler dresses, dressing gowns, or alterations, 3 or 4 days in a row each month, the chiropodist occasionally, the manicurist once a week for a few months only, while the hairdresser she went to on Saturdays was short of staff, and sometimes the doctor. At 11, dressed and combed with her face on, she would bring the telephone down, which she had used for her morning calls from bed, and which was now to be made available to Susan, that's the housekeeper, for orders to the butcher and the grocer. She would plug the thing in, a hard, sharp, firm plack, followed by a tiny ping, tap across the polished floor of the hall, and then came the dragging sound of the sliding doors as she shut herself into the lounge for the morning with her headache. Sometimes she would ring for a jug of ice. Next on the agenda would be lunch. Because there were linen mats,
I have met this kind of Joe Burger, hung out with them ever since I was a child, and also rented from a lady once called Denise, whose life was also past this former glory of the 1970s white suburban South African woman. Yeah, after her husband died, I rented a room in her home in 2014. So I know this. I know this world. I know exactly what she's talking about.
instead of a cloth, and because the lunch was light, as she was dieting to become slim, Mrs. Furman called it picnicking. They had noodles in runny tomato sauce, or curried meat with cakes of snow white rice, or minced fish balls fried in breadcrumbs, and a side dish of tomatoes or asparagus or mushrooms, and a dessert of stewed fruit or jelly and cream, followed by fruit served on plates with a raised pattern of purple plums and dark green leaves. The fruit knives and forks were like the fish knives and forks, with the same ivory handles and chased metal, only narrower. And the glass finger bowl.
So what this speaks to is, as my husband says, when the British sent the white people here, they sent their best and brightest. And a lot of the people in South Africa, say for instance the 1820 settlers, are descendants of gentlefolk. And so you've got these notions, they're actually written into the fabric of South Africa's what we would call middle-class society. Today, again, politically available to everybody, but of course there are massive economic barriers to entry. And so that might contextualize some of the luxury that I've spoken about that does exist in South Africa, in spite of, I've spoken about it on this channel. There are 10 different class groups in South Africa, and each one of those 10 has 2 subgroups. Okay, so don't just see South Africa as a sort of, for lack of a better term, as a sort of black and white thing. I'm speaking about economically. Okay. But I know this world that she's talking about. But just because we're speaking about an English-speaking family doesn't mean that those notions then don't translate into people of all languages. But keep letting her paint the picture.
Balls, there were slices of lemon so thin you could see through them. Then there was coffee in little cups drunk at the table. Then Mrs. Furman stamped on the brass button, which was set on the floor under the table, and lunch was over. And then the whole house died. Mrs. Furman went for her lie-down in her pink bedroom, first stripping out the plug of the telephone again and carrying the instrument with her, balanced on one hand, though she wouldn't plug it in up there until 4 o'clock. And in the other hand, she carried a fruit plate with a knife and a green apple on it, and under her arm the detective story she had been reading in the morning, Agatha Christie or Ellery Queen, which was rubbish that she only read for relaxation. What she really liked was Shakespeare, Balzac, Dante, and Homer. Once her husband returned home from work, then this would be followed by a formal dinner with her family, then playing piano and drinking until bed. And that's how this woman spent every day of her life. It is actually at one of these dinners when Annie's parents are discussing the color problem and how with...
Okay, she's going to delve deeper into that, but I'm hoping to give you guys a sort of visual reference of what she's saying. So how about I search for that? Michael... That's what I was searching for on my phone. Let's see if we can... It's something like that. I hope the man's name is spelled like that. I'll double check that. Bjork. U-E-R-K. So he hasn't got an E here. There we go. Okay, so she's about to speak about the stark differences. But there's this one moment in this video.
There's something up.
Which absolutely encapsulates this, and I hope that it'll contextualize it for you. I've shown this video a number of times on my thing before. Okay, and I'm going to put a link in the description to Kensani's video as well, because, as I said, she's riveting.
At range, the ammunition was still deadly. Nearby buildings were peppered with gunshots. More than 20 were wounded, 3 of them seriously. Many others were taken secretly to be treated in private for fear of arrest.
Our cameras recorded it in all its brutal intensity and sent the pictures around the world. They hated us.
Okay, so at some point in the video, he draws a difference between sort of the stark comparison of life on the streets in South Africa and the kind of life Kinsani is talking about.
Get out now, very quickly, okay? Because you people are the fucking cause of this now. Yeah, all right. So get out. Okay.
The battlegrounds of apartheid were the townships, where blacks were lucky to be allowed to live, though still as foreigners in their own land. 12 miles up the road, and a world away, was where I lived. Our white suburbs were dedicated to the pursuit of graciousness. When our blacks were hungry, we didn't tell them to eat cake, we ate it ourselves. This banquet in aid of the starving was held with the country in a state of emergency, the townships in flames, and drought searing the black homelands. But there were more important things to talk about.
And what are we going to wear?
There it is. And what are we going to wear? And over here, he highlights the backdrop. So I'll put a link in the description to this, and you'll kind of get the undercurrent of what Kinsani's speaking about, okay? Fascinating stuff. Fascinating. Kinsani, take it away, girl.
Without it, South Africa would be a paradise, as if for the lip of her life. It is actually at one of these dinners when Annie's parents are discussing the colour problem and how without it, South Africa would be a paradise, as if for them it wasn't already so. It's especially funny because Annie's parents consider themselves quite liberal. They frequently lament about the plight of the native people and how they wish for an equal society, while they're constantly doted on by a procession of underpaid black servants. The same people who, while Annie and her mom are having that spectacular lunch, would finish the washing up quickly. Meat would have been carried out along with a pot of millie meal to the palisaded yard, where they'd sit among the dustbins on fruit boxes and stones. They had thick slices of brown bread on a tin plate soaked through with peach jam. They dipped old-looking spoons, spotty as though they were peeling, into the 2 pots of millie meal and stewed meat. They always finished every scrap of it. But the bottom of the porridge was usually burnt, and the lumps were scraped out with a long iron spoon into a dustbin, except on Mondays when Hannah, that's the laundry maid, would unwind a cloth from her head and tie up the cold, white, yellow, brown, and black lumps safely for carrying home.
So, what Kinsani isn't directly speaking about here, because she's speaking about black and white, I also want to speak about another level in South Africa and globally, really, about racism. You see, so I do these Black Excellence Tuesdays because I often feel, and I've tried to express this multiple times on this channel, that black South Africans are consistently scapegoated. But here I'm going to speak up for all South Africans as an Anglophone South African, right? Much like Kinsani, we'll have similar backgrounds. You can hear in the similarity of our accents that we have a similar socioeconomic circle. So I come from the stock that would have lived in Johannesburg in the grey areas, been born there during the 80s, right? Urban Johannesburg, Hillbrow, Yeoville, Berea. Okay, perhaps I'll give you an indication of what that looks like, just to give you... Oh, sorry, I want to talk about Boitsamelo in a moment. Congratulations to her. So let's look at Hillbrow, 1980s. Let's see if we can find it. Okay, so these areas were grey areas. We were born there, right? And they were, when I call them grey areas, they were the one place that you could kind of get away with crime. The crime of having interracial friends. The crime of being in a gay relationship. These were legislated crimes, right? Those kinds of things. And so, yeah. And so at that time, if you lived there, we were amongst the most economically privileged in the world, irrespective of color. It's much more nuanced than that, right? But we also tended to be Anglophone. We tended to be English speaking, and with English being the language of liberalists in this country and the language of liberation, unlike, in stark contrast to every other former British colony, there was also a sense of moral superiority that we had ingrained in us, right? So those of us living in the actual city. And my generation would be the first also to desegregate its classes, right? We'd be the first ones in interracial classes. I experienced that a number of times because I went to 6 different schools. And so, yeah, sorry, this is such sticky territory. And so we did have a sense of moral superiority, even to those who were richer than us and that kind of thing. because people who lived in other parts of the country were living the realities of apartheid, you know, or I often found that the further they lived away from the city centre, the more narrow their worldview. They tended to live in suburbs or townships in which everybody was their own race, their own socioeconomic circle, their own kind of thing, right? And so it's funny because as coloured kids with an accent like mine, we'd make fun of other coloured kids with an accent a bit more like this. Black kids would do the same thing. White kids even would make fun of, they'd speak like me and they'd make fun of the other white people that spoke like this, perhaps on the West or East Rand. Do you know what I mean? And we even had the sense of superiority in the sense of, like, we thought we were cooler or better because we liked, let's say, British comedy or British media, and we would have these sort of dialogues around, you know, American entertainment was for the masses. We literally used that term. And what's ironic is now in our 30s, you know, we tend to have moved out into those very suburbs that we once kind of looked down on as being sort of shallow and that kind of thing. And that now we are the biggest voice against an Anglo-centric perspective. And I say this because in spite of the fact that we are now criticizing Afrikaners, I still stand by what I've said multiple times on this channel before. Having reflected on my own and my own generation's Anglo-centric sense of superiority, I don't even know how to articulate this. I still speak to you around the world as fellow English speakers and ask you to consider your own sense of superiority, right? That please judge South Africans the same way you judge everybody else. Please remember that we are speaking about a certain group of South Africans, and I wouldn't like necessarily white South Africans or black South Africans or Indian South Africans, whatever, like to be judged because of the worst example of who they are, right? That's not the everyday person that I live with. I live with amazing people here in South Africa every single day, and that's the majority, okay? And I feel highly privileged to live with them. But anyway, let's go on to this girl who is far more articulate than I. Gosh, she fascinates me. No end.
And the stark difference between the experience of black and white wasn't lost on anyone. If the talk was about politics, as it often was, Mrs. Furman always said, "One feels so helpless in this dreadful situation. The important thing is to treat those immediately about one decently and considerately, regardless of colour." Never mind that this is the same woman who refers to all African languages as Zulu, constantly accuses the staff of theft, and loves to address the female help, the adult female help, as either that stupid girl, creature, or most affectionately, slut. One of my favorite parts is...
And that's why seemingly innocent words in other English-speaking countries can carry deeply racist connotations. Words such as maid, words such as Bantu, which just means people, and words such as madam. They all have racial connotations within the South African context. Though we won't argue with the rest of you about them, we all kind of get a khril as English-speaking South Africans.
Is when they have a repairman come over to fix their geyser and everyone is freaking out because they can't figure out where he's going to have his lunch, since as a coloured man he can't sit with the black workers, and obviously just letting him have lunch in the house is not even a possibility. That's where the actual people eat, don't be crazy. At the time,
I tried to demonstrate this before, that the very utensils that were used in the house and the very spaces you were allowed to occupy in a house were dictated not by law so much as these cultural rules that we had, right? And yeah, I think she's about to describe that.
A critic praised this novel for how it depicted the vicious lethargy of middle-class life. And while that's quite true, once you realize that living in a sprawling estate with servants and private school money made you middle class in this period, I can fully appreciate why anything remotely approaching equity in post-apartheid South Africa feels like a war zone. I refuse.
Right. South Africans' notion of middle class is very different from international middle class to this day. And most people just want to look at that on the surface, and she's got it.
to even dignify the concept of white genocide by presenting all the very many ways in which that's actually factually and contractually untrue. And I think at this point, if you genuinely buy into the idea that a group of people who've spent decades luxuriating and profiting off the exploitation, displacement, and alienation of people of color have now had those tables turned on them, then I can only ask that you'll give Henry Kissinger a kiss from me when you're in hell. But what I will dignify is that compared to this, these people are suffering today. Do they qualify as refugees? No. Do they deserve asylum? Absolutely not. Am I happy they're gone? Yes.
Oh my gosh. And can we just, something Dan Quarter pointed out when he was on the Piers Morgan show. He pointed out that what Elon Musk refers to as race laws are actually equity laws. They're being framed as being anti-white, but they're not being framed as being anti-men, even though many of them speak about the rights of women. They're not being portrayed as being anti-able people, even though many of them speak about the rights of people that are disabled. These laws that Elon Musk is calling anti-white. Sure. They will say you must have a certain percentage of black people, which most South Africans agree with, as I've shown multiple times on this channel. They'll say you have to have a certain percentage of women and a certain minimum also of disabled people. A lot of things in South Africa are like that. And what people like Afroforum and Elon Musk were assuming is that nobody was going to actually read the laws. And Dan Quarter went and read a lot of them. Not all. He admits that he didn't read all, but he read a lot of them and he went, So anyway, yeah. Okay, Kinsani.
What can I say? I'm a huge proponent of white flight. I think that if to this day you can look around yourself in a country cited as one of the most unequal in the world and still feel like you are burdened by some grand injustice as if everyone is treating you unfairly, then I hope you have a great time in Australia or now America, which famously has such great healthcare and access to resources, right?
Ooh, shots fired. But one thing I'm confident about, having lived in America, is, and having traveled much of the world, is, again, not all white South Africans, please, not even most, but there are those, the kinds Kinsani is describing and the kinds that have recently been imported into America. Even racist people in those countries are going to run out of patience far faster than South Africans will, because there are subtle nuances that are lost upon non-South Africans about these dynamics, right? They're immensely complex. But good luck, I suppose. Okay. I really don't want to take up all of Kinsani's video. I wanted to just give you guys a taster. So I'm going to go ahead and watch it because I am absolutely chomping at the bits. But how about you guys enjoy? Okay, I'll give you a link in the description. You guys can go watch it for yourselves. Okay, so thanks for joining Nuance with Nikki, and ciao for now.